Haidete o Filoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I'm talking with Carla Hurt. Carla is a high school Latin teacher based in Melbourne, Australia, and it was a great conversation. She also does ancient Greek. She has her website is found in antiquity. She has a Latin and a Greek channel on YouTube. You can find her on Blue Sky and Twitter under similar handles, link in the show notes. And we talk about pedagogy. We talk about writing tiered text, which she's produced one, and she has another on the way. And I think a key to this conversation for those of us who are learners rather than teachers is to remember that, one, we cover a lot of really good language acquisition principles in this discussion, but also when you're an autodidact or you're learning on your own, you're kind of your own teacher too. So you kind of navigate both sides of it. So it helps to have a little bit of the teaching theory as well. So I think there's going to be some cool stuff in there to pick up. And there's some themes in this episode too from my conversation with Colin Gorey a few weeks ago and other episodes before about just general language learning and learning the world and the culture of these texts as well. So I hope you'll enjoy it and grab your earbuds and listen in for yet another great, if not a bit longer, conversation. Well, hi, Carla. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do an interview.
Thank you for having me on, and Ezekiel as well.
Yes.
So if we hear his breathing noises, we'll know where that's coming from.
That's right. He's your first, right?
He's my firstborn son.
Nice.
He's 4 months old now, just
Wow.
turned 4 months. I believe he may be hitting the 4-month regression, but right now he is sound asleep.
Yes, I have two girls, and my second, when she hit, I want to say about 8 weeks, decided to have colic for the next 2 months,
Oh
which was a real
dear.
joy.
Oh dear.
But it's fun.
But it's totally worth it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I
Um,
never got this before I was a parent that it can be really hard and yet still be really, really worth it.
yeah, and it's one of the few things I think in life that pays off that way. I mean, there are other things certainly, and um, not to lessen or cause grief for those who wanted kids and can't have them. I mean, that's a thing too.
Mm,
But
that's true.
um,
So we were going to talk about
yes,
Greek stuff.
Greek stuff and Latin stuff
Yeah,
because you do
and
both,
Latin
right?
things. That's right. I'm a Latin teacher at Heathdale Christian College. I've always been trying to convince the higher ups that actually ancient Greek is a much better language to offer than Latin, but there's a lot more uptake for Latin in my state. There's
Hmm.
about, 15 or 17 or so schools offering Latin in Victoria in Australia. Whereas for ancient Greek, I think there's only one school offering it in the whole state,
Wow.
and they have to take a exam from a different state, from New South Wales.
Huh.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
there used to be two schools, and it used to be a VCE, like Victorian subject.
Mhm.
But when one of the schools dropped out of it, then the other one was forced to take the exam from the neighboring state.
So, okay, so let me clarify something. You said you teach at a college. Does that word mean something different in UK English than it does for me as an
Oh,
American?
in Australian, you can have a high school named a such and such college,
Okay,
Scotch College, Heathdale Christian College.
gotcha.
That just means high school.
All right.
But yeah, college for you guys means something else. And also when you say school, it means something else. Like school can mean university, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could call university a school. I mean, it's generic, right? Unless you specify what kind, it could be anything from kindergarten up through, I mean, even preschool, I guess, up through,
Yeah.
a PhD level.
Yeah, no, in Australian English, school is only like from preschool to end of year 12, end of high school. And
Okay.
then from then on, it's uni.
Right. Yeah.
You never say uni, do you?
Not really. You would say I go to a university. Um,
Yeah.
but usually people say I go to college, which is weird because like formally a college is a part of a university. If it's a
Yes.
university, then the colleges are like
Collega.
the major divisions, and then there's maybe schools within each college. I think I'm getting that right, which is weird. But
Hmm.
anyway,
Blame the Roman. Blame the medieval people using Latin terms about this.
yeah, that sounds good. And then we'll just blame Americans for trying to be different than the rest of the English speaking world.
Oh.
Um,
But yeah, I teach at a high school. It's in the west of Melbourne, a bit different from the other schools that offer Latin in Victoria because it's not in the most economically prosperous place.
okay.
It's not in the inner city, east of the city, posh suburbs, leafy green suburbs. I mean, I guess there are nice trees here, but it's out in the west where it's a bit more, it's almost rural when you get to Werribee. And then the city basically starts from Hoppers Crossing, I feel. But when people talk of the city, going into the city, they mean taking an hour long or maybe a half hour long train ride or an hour long drive to get into the city in peak hour traffic. So, yeah,
I'm
it's a
laughing.
different place for Latin.
I'm laughing because I kind of understand you. I actually do live in a very rural county, about an hour west of Richmond here in Virginia. And so, it's an hour for me to get to the city. Now, that's without traffic. If it was with traffic, it'd be worse, I assume. But it is also it is very funny when I am saying, yeah, I'm a linguist and a translator that lives in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. I just find that to be funny.
Yeah, yeah. So, I really enjoy teaching at Heathdale. It's not quite as uh, high stakes pressure
Yeah.
as I did teach at a school, Melbourne Girls Grammar, in the inner east, and there was very different workplace culture there, and I much prefer this one.
Yeah. So, okay, so teaching high school, I think, most of the people I've had on here have either taught, with the exception, I think, of Andrew Morehouse, I think have taught at the university level or, they teach privately online or through like something like Ancient Language
Yes.
Institute or
All,
Polis or whatever.
yeah, very different avenues
Yeah.
because with teaching at high school level, especially teaching out in the outer suburbs, you're going to get a lot of students in your classes who are not inherently the most
Mm,
interested in classics,
okay.
but you want to make it accessible to everyone, uh, including people who aren't extremely passionate about it, you know?
Yeah, and that's interesting because, with something like, if you're taking a class, you know, if, if you're a teacher at say one of the institutes like, ancient language or biblical language
Yes.
center, like students are paying hundreds of dollars to take this class. They're motivated, right? Whereas in your case, that may not
Yeah.
be the case. So,
Well, they might be indirectly paying hundreds of dollars to take my course, but
well, the
it's their
parents might.
parents who are doing it. Yeah, exactly. And I try to spell it out to them. You're wasting your parents' money if you're not listening to me, but that argument never works.
Yeah, I don't imagine that's very motivating for many high schoolers.
Not particularly convincing argument. No, the you're wasting your parents' money argument. No, doesn't work.
but actually, that does stem. I'm sorry. I think that does actually tie into one of the principles of comprehensible input, right? Is it's supposed to be compelling.
Mm.
So, sometimes even if we're in a class um, where I think maybe people in a university program, like they want to take Greek or they may want to major in classics, but
Mm.
they may not actually have any interest in the particular text they have to take for their degree program. So, what have you
Mm.
found ways to help encourage interest in something that when there may be like resistance to that?
I find that success is extremely motivating. So when students feel like they can have an easy win, like
Mm,
you present them with texts which are at their level and which are quite easily comprehensible. The fact that they can comprehend it gives them a motivation of,
Yep.
oh, this is something that I can do, and in fact will do. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of uh, things people can say about motivation. In the end, you can't control someone else's motivation. Like that's some hard lesson that I kind of had to learn myself. Like no matter how interesting, fun, everything I make my lessons, there will be some students who decide on day one that Latin's not their thing.
Mm,
And for that, you do kind of need to be the adult authority in the room and just say, you need to help everyone else learn and we're all in this together kind of thing.
yeah.
But at the end of the day, you need to pull your weight and I will keep monitoring and things like that. Uh, there's a kind of mix of being the fun teacher and also putting your foot down and saying, look, guys, you can't request that we always do a vocab quiz game every lesson.
Yes.
I plan fun activities and I believe that learning is fun. So it's things like that, which I guess teaching adult learners, you don't necessarily have that kind of authority over your students. They're a lot more mature as well, so you don't really need to exercise such a thing. Adults are able to kind of um, understand that something might be a bit boring, but they can get something out of it and they won't necessarily
Mm,
complain a whole lot. Uh, whereas these kids are going through a hormonal period of their life. You got to keep that in mind. And they don't always have a whole lot of good things happening at home necessarily either.
mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm laughing too because I tutor very badly. I tutor Latin for a small homeschool group. I have like four students, and
Hmm.
some things you've said have been quite similar. Like they're younger, so they're what we would call middle school, so like grade 7. But there's
Yes.
definitely some hormones happening and some like, hey, can we play that vocab game again? And it's like, okay, well, this is arguably far better than the textbook we've been assigned to use, so sure. But um,
Yeah, that's
anyway,
right.
that's funny.
Year seven and year eight is definitely the pain point for me, where uh, the content itself may be easy, but the students are the hardest,
Hmm.
especially because in my school, it's a compulsory subject at year seven.
Uh,
And up until this year, it was compulsory at year eight as well. Um, yeah. But yeah, from next year onwards, it's elective from year eight. So
okay.
that's kind of exciting.
Hmm. So, so you're a t Latin teacher at a what we call high school, or you call a college in Australia. How did?
It's definitely a high school, even though the name of the school is college.
Okay,
You'd never like go around. It's a college. Yeah,
okay. So high
it's a high
school.
school.
Stick
Yeah.
with that. Got it. Um, so you're doing that. So how did you get into classical languages? Where did it start for you?
I learnt it in high school. So I went to Melbourne Girls Grammar and learnt it from there. And I kept up Latin in university. I did a classics degree and learned ancient Greek in university as well. So yeah, I was thinking maybe I'd go into ancient world studies or something, but just the more I did Latin, the more of a nerd I became about Latin. And the more I did Latin, the more I wished I knew ancient Greek. So I learned ancient Greek and got my classics degree all together. So I guess you can't really do classics with only one of the languages. It's okay, buddy. So he's stirring a little bit. He might go back to sleep though.
Uh, well, whatever his needs are, that's the important thing, right? You gotta
Yeah,
take care of the
that's
kids.
right.
So, um, okay. So when in your high school and university experience, um, was that like comprehensible input or active,
Uh,
whatever the correct
in
term is, or
high
was that more
school,
the grammar translation style?
In high school, I'd say it was kind of a mix of the two because it was the reading method of Cambridge Latin course.
Okay.
And, pure old CI people would say, oh, the reading textbooks are not CI because they've got a grammar sequence to them.
Right.
But technically, they have input, they have quite a lot of stories. And it's a course built around reading gradually more and more complicated stories
Hmm.
that are all part of the same plot. It's kind of meant to be compelling and bring you along, draw you along with wanting to know what happens next. So the Cambridge Latin course is built around quite a lot of that pedagogy of wanting to give you exposure to the language and give you easier language at the start, harder language at the end, and kind of try to give you a gradient of difficulty in between.
Mm.
Uh, there, in practice, though, when you learn from a reading course, teachers usually do supplement it a lot with grammar, drills, memorization, tables, all of that. They'll
Hmm.
make tests with that. So it ends up being a blended model. And I'd say it's because there's always gaps in a textbook.
Yeah.
And so teachers always have to fill the gap somehow. The easiest way to fill a gap is to make a drill out of it or make them memorize something to help
Mm.
support some pain point. So yeah, it's sort of a blend, but I felt that I did benefit from having had a lot of reading in my Latin. And when I finished high school, I I think that maybe I felt more confident than I really was because when I read Livy in Latin, I felt completely defeated in first year university. But I gradually just kept on reading and built up all the proficiency of that. Uh, it was also around that time Harry Potter had come out, and there was a Harry Potter Latin. There were two
Yes.
books of Harry Potter in Latin, so I read both of them, and I feel like that really helped support my language ability. Even
Mm.
though people do say that the Harry Potter translations in Latin are not the best Latin translations, I felt that it was a good amount of Latin that really and the act of reading it without trying to look up everything was quite freeing.
And I don't know how this works for you, but for me, if I'm reading in English, um, for example, say I'm reading a bunch of older stuff written by, somebody like, I don't know, G.K. Chesterton or, somebody from the 1800s, something like that. Like the way I
Yeah.
then write for a while afterwards is influenced by the
Yes.
style that I've been spending a lot of time reading. So even though it might be, we would say different English from what I normally speak, like my ability kind of is swayed by it, and then it can also sway back another way. So like part of me wonders
Yeah.
is it really such a bad thing to read less than optimal, you know, Latin, Greek texts? Because if you then go read, if that builds your ability to the point that you can then go read like the original text with a meaningful level of comprehension and a good reading speed, if you stick with that, you'll absorb quote, proper grammar or proper style or whatever.
Sorry, he's kind of screaming a little bit, but he might go back down. I'll give it one more chance and then I'll bring my chair over and nurse him for a bit. But I do have opinions about this whole, is it okay to have language in the classroom that is not particularly authentic? And it really kind of comes down to a degree of how inauthentic this is. Are we
Hmm.
talking like the differences between Australian and UK and US English, in which case it is no problem whatsoever? Are we talking about the differences between uh, a made up language that only exists in the classroom and how people actually speak as human beings? Then it does matter
Hmm.
because then it kind of breaks the fundamentals of what a language is. Like if the language is not using any pronouns, is not using discourse particles ever, is using just the noun over and over and over, and using phrases that appear extremely English-like. I think
Hmm.
that that is kind of like trying to give people Latin words through an English structure, but it's not necessarily the kind of language exposure
Right.
that to me feels authentic as a language. People will debate me on that, but I do try to get to write with the Latinitas that I can muster, and to write with the style that makes it feel like a real language, even when simplifying for students, like reducing the complexity of text, reducing the scope of a topic, but trying to express it the way it would sound in Latin
Right.
if they were saying it, like explain it like I'm five kind of thing. But
Well,
you wouldn't break your language when you're explaining it like I'm five.
because I think as we're learning, like it's it's far less useful to map word to word than I think it is to map, say, like expression to expression or idea to idea. Like I was
Mm.
chatting with someone last night, and I was trying to think, how do I say from time to time in Greek? And like I've never seen that phrase, and he's like, well, just
Mm.
eniote, which I think is more sometimes. Like that's the best we come up
Mm.
with in the moment, but
In
that's
in
the
in Latin, it would be interdum,
right. But if that's the
but it wouldn't
you
be
know,
like from time
yeah,
to time. Yeah,
right. But they have a phrase for, I mean, they have a way to say that idea. So it's better to map from. So if I was going to make a flashcard, I'd write from time to time and put interdum on the back, probably, or vice versa,
yeah.
because that would be maybe a more salient mapping for me.
Mm.
Um, and I think like that,
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
that's useful because then you're saying, well,
Yeah,
my brain wants to say from time to time because that's what I would say in English, but then in Greek or Latin, I need to say this other thing. And if I teach myself that, then I can, that pathway builds up until I can speak naturally, hopefully.
exactly. I find that things are only hard because you haven't been exposed to it.
Yeah.
So if we always protect people from things that we consider hard by speaking in like CIEs, uh, language classroomese, then the things that we are afraid to give them will always be hard to students.
Yeah.
Like you have to expose people gradually. And I think also we have to, it's okay, buddy. I might actually go and get the chair. I'll interrupt that and I'll come back.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right, where were we? It was
Uh,
if
we were
yeah,
talking about, yeah,
if you
like
shelter
lack of
something, it
exposure.
stays
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
So you have to learn, you have to have a plan of unsheltering somehow. That sort
Mm,
of gap between learner texts and authentic texts needs to be bridged somehow. And that's why all these textbook courses are trying to use things that the CI people are saying, oh, that's too hard. I'll simplify it. I'll get rid of it. Like using the pronouns, for example, using ille and is and all that scattered in there, eum instead of repeating the noun. Uh, yeah, it was if you expose people to it, they won't get it the first time. That's totally fine.
right.
Uh, but over time, those pathways get well used, well worn, and they'll pick it up. So I think that we need to be a little bit tolerant of some level of ambiguity, some level of incomprehension in our classes because it's not all going to happen at once. They're not going to learn the entire language at once, and they're also gonna not going to learn the language that they never get exposed to. So I think like exposing them to things that they don't yet know is a good thing.
Well, and isn't that the whole, like there's I think a couple of principles come to mind. I mean, we say comprehensible input should be ideally, 95, 97% comprehensible, meaning there's 3 to 5% that you don't know yet. Um,
Mm,
so yeah, I mean, but then there's that principle too of like order of acquisition is kind of beyond our control. Like
mm,
people acquire stuff kind of in a set order, in a sense, regardless of what if they're exposed to it, they acquire it or acquire mastery of it in sort of a set order. Um, so
yeah, and you can't necessarily make anyone acquire anything. You can set
right.
up the conditions for acquisition, but you can't make it happen. So, and at the same time, you're going to have a classroom in which there's more than one person. There's obviously more than one level that
Hmm.
someone is at. And the bigger the class, the more levels you're going to get. You can't ensure that absolutely everyone in the class has 97% of the words in a given text,
Yeah.
unless you're setting the text at the level of the absolute weakest student in the class, which I have done that before. I have tried what would happen if I set the difficulty of text low but made it a very large volume, like
Hmm.
larger than I'd had before, and see what happens to the scores of all the students. And what I found was that the scores bunched up. Like the weaker students did really well, like they improved quite a bit, but the stronger students kind of rested on their laurels
Hmm.
and didn't improve as much as I would be seeing if they were given text at their level. So, I mean, it made them easy to teach from then on because they kind of bunched up together.
Yeah.
But I felt like I had kind of lost an opportunity to push the higher level students a bit more and to get their comprehension of more difficult things, the foundations laid for them to read harder stuff sooner.
Yeah. That's interesting. Um, I mean, it seems like I'm just, I'm thinking through the like sort of Paul Nation's four strands thing. It's like you gave your more advanced students a whole bunch of fluency development, essentially with material they were familiar with,
Yeah.
which meant they didn't progress as far as quickly, but they got really comfortable with some stuff.
Yes.
While
And they
also,
absolutely loved it. They enjoyed it. It certainly was they would have enjoyed it if I hadn't done that though. That's the thing. Like
yeah.
they were the kind of students who would have enjoyed a greater challenge as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, I feel like I was trying to bank on that 97% principle and thinking fluency, 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 but it wasn't necessarily giving me the results that I had when things were maybe too hard for some of the class. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that that's where tiered texts come in. You want to provide uh, the lowest students with accessible texts. You want them to be able to participate and get into the story that we're all reading together. But you also want to expose people to that authentic language and get them used to the way that the language is really written outside of textbooks, outside of their courses. And I think tiered text is a great way to ensure that these the needs of both the low students and the high students are being met at different points in the same class.
Okay. So for the define, if you would, for me, what is a tiered text?
Yes, of course. So that is, say we had a passage from Virgil. It is the simile where Dido is being compared to a deer running through the forest who has been shot by an arrow, and the hunter who shot the arrow doesn't know that he shot it, etc., etc. It's like a long extended simile that says that Aeneas, the main character, has kind of become an object of love for Dido, the queen who he's visiting.
Okay.
And that passage, you could give it to them, to the students as written, and give them a whole bunch of vocab help, grammar help. They'll read the first few words and get stuck. They'll consult the dictionary, consult the grammar, consult the notes that you meticulously wrote for them, and they'll be, okay, I'm unstuck now. And then they go back a few more words. Sorry.
Oh,
It's okay, baby. They'll get themselves stuck and unstuck with a few words at a time. Whereas what you can do is rewrite the whole passage several times in gradually easier language, and then present them with the easiest version first. One which gives them a broad overview of uh, Queen Dido is like the deer who's running through the forest, etc., etc., in as easy language as you can muster in the target language. Then you give them the next version of that, the same story again, but with more of the structures, more of the difficult features of the final text, but not quite as much as in the final text. And then you give them another version. I like to give them a version where it's the same as the final text, but the word order is rearranged so that it is easier for the learner to pick out where the nouns and adjectives go together, and putting the sentence together in their head is easier if it's in a more prose-like word order as opposed to when it's written in poetry. So,
Mm.
and then finally give them the poetry. And they've read this about 3 or 4 times, maybe. This is their third or fourth reading. And now they know exactly what's supposed to be happening. They're just reading it again and seeing how it's actually put together, how the order of the words they can you can compare the order of the words in this final version to in the previous version and say, ah, how mixed up that is. Is that a literary device that we've been studying, guys, called synthesis or something? And get them to notice the details of the text that are not present in the earlier tiers that are part of the art form of the poetry. So that is a way for the whole class to read from the easiest to the hardest version of a text. And uh, very often, because you might need to give them some vocab help along the way, depending
Mhm.
on what their needs are. You could, as the teacher, kind of say, like, oh, yeah, that word, it's similar to that word in the previous tier, and they might be able to get it, or you might just need to give it to them. But because the text has kind of been expanded about 3 or 4 times, the frequency at which you need to give them help really decreases. They get a lot more of
Mm.
their own reading done before they get stuck and need help. So yeah, it's good in so many ways. It also reinforces the plot with them. It can be really hard for students to remember what they've read when they've only been reading a few words at a time and they reach the end of a paragraph and you ask them, "What did you just read?" And they're like,
Yeah.
"Ah, something about an ablative absolute." Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're
They
absolutely
can
right.
remember
Like,
what they struggled with, but not what was actually said.
well, it's like we can only hold so much in active memory at any given point. So if you're not reading quickly enough, you tend to lose what was before because you've had to spend so much time, like so much mental effort processing bits and
Yeah.
pieces. So yeah, reading speed and ability to read, fluently is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got your actually I pulled up the Lover's Curse. I've tried to read bits and pieces of it as I've been getting ready to tutor Latin.
Mm.
And Latin's my Greek is far better than my Latin at this point. By leaps and bounds. But I mean, I see your point. Like it seems like you've got a chunk of verses that you're gonna teach through, and then you've got a couple of explanatory things like an image or two and some simple sentences, and then like the first level starts with like Dido sola est. It's like she's alone, and the second one it looks like it's getting one shorter with each tier, and I'm assuming
Mm.
as a result much more compact and dense until you're finally at what Virgil's original. I'm assuming.
Yes, exactly. Because the earlier tiers contain explanation, which is implied in the final tier.
Right.
The poetry of Virgil is quite dense, quite compact. He's a master of using words in that kind of efficient way that good writers can use it, where one word can have so much meaning in it,
Hmm.
has so much weight. But also he makes learned allusions to things, things like he mentions places and people that the students may not be particularly familiar with, like, oh, who are the Garamantians? What does that mean to me?
Yeah.
And I like to explain that in the tiers as I go along. So I'll be like, they're an African tribe or something like that.
Well, and that's from a writing perspective, I think that's great because you've in those lower tiers you can add in all that background information in simple, easy to understand sentences, which
Hmm.
promotes fluency and then final comprehension. Um,
Yes.
I was
Without
telling
having
people,
to break over to footnotes. All
right.
these footnotes of like, oh yes, the Garamantians, an African tribe.
Well, and even that, like jumping from text to footnote, that requires processing
Mm,
effort, which then is taking away from what's available to remember and process the text. So yeah, if you can
yes.
keep people in the same spot, that's really helpful.
Yes. I really not a huge fan of jumping down to footnotes, especially when reading as a whole class and
Mm.
projecting on the projector. I want it to all be in the body text if I can, because scrolling down and then scrolling back up while on a projector is quite painful.
It's kind of
And
like that
trying
thing
to
when
zoom
someone's
out
on.
so that it's yeah, like I can't do marginal notes either, like the Orberg style stuff,
Yeah,
because I zoom out too much, the text gets too small to
yeah,
see. Which is why I have my explanations, the picture stuff. That's all in line. It's like, okay, let's look at all the pictures first. Okay, now we all go together into this paragraph.
yeah,
It's that was my way of keeping the text size large enough on the screen.
yeah. That makes sense. Actually, I was chatting online with some folks about that. For Greek related to I was messing around with lingua franca, parsa illustrata, and dropping some images
Mm,
and things in text, and that led to a um, couple of ideas being swapped back and forth about how can we build tooling to make authoring text like this easier, where you could say, well, here's the text, but I want to drop something in at this point, and then
yeah,
later define what
that
that is.
exactly
Um,
because you want the margins to link up with the body text, and that is quite a nightmare
oh, yes,
formatting.
no kidding.
So I try to avoid that by just making everything in line. And
Yeah,
then you can do things like make an audio book, which everything has to be in line if it's an audio book.
yes, it does.
You can do an ebook, everything's in line. It's like I completely avoid the margin problem by just not using margins.
Well, and like you said, you can get around that by using tiers. So one of my because you can tier one can have all those explanations in it.
Yeah.
So here's my next question. As a student, from the student side of it, using a tiered reader, how do they do that? Do they read tier one all the way through, or do they read, say, because like I've noticed in your book, you've got, verses 1 through 5, and then tier one, two, three, and then final, the
Hmm.
original. So how do you teach through that, and how would you recommend a student make use of something like that?
Well, personally, I like to approach the new text with my students in class
Yeah.
because I like to hear how they're going and hear them aloud. Like, what does this say? So I do something called choral translation, where I'll pull up a text on screen and point to it with my cursor or something and say, all right, I'm going to point to it in English word order and we're going to translate it aloud all together. And I can pause and hear them say a word or like struggle to get a word. And that gives me the instant information of, oh, they need help with that word.
Hmm.
But I mean, from a perspective of try not to translate everything, that is kind of violating all that. But from the perspective of I want to know exactly where the pain points are for my students, I find choral translation very good at making their comprehension extremely clear to me. So I will read, say, the sentence or the paragraph aloud in Latin first and say to them, try to put it together in your mind, try to keep an image in your mind of what's happening here. And then we go and chorally translate it together. We reach the final tier, and because my students are going to be tested on this text at the end of the year, like there'll be a big high stakes examination that they sit, that the rest of the state sits, then I'll get them to write their own translation of the final tier
Hmm.
as a sort of final way of making sure, yes, you do understand all of the final words, and that's the part that you need to pay the most attention to. And yeah, so also because we translate it aloud together, I don't have to have that problem of setting it as homework and then checking it in class when
Hmm.
half the class has not done their homework. And also, you have to say it out loud before you then explore things like techniques or references or imagery and stuff together. You can kind of incorporate a lot of the discussion of the text into the reading of the text if you all read it together initially.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I like to set the initial reading in class. And despite it being about like maybe 4 or 5 times longer than the actual text of Virgil, I find that we get through it in class just as quickly, if not more, than when I was back in the day of writing notes for the thing setting translations for them to do at home, and then we check the translation in class and discuss the text in class. So I feel like I've saved class time, or kept it the same while giving them about 5 times the exposure to Latin and
Yeah.
not having a problem where students aren't doing their homework. And then I set for homework, revise these lines at home, reread your Latin text, please. And I'll try to make you accountable in some way for having revised it. But yeah, we'll do maybe some kind of activity where we reread old passages at the start of the next week.
So okay, so that's really that makes a lot of sense. If I think a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are probably learning on their own or maybe in a small
Hmm.
class.
Hmm.
So say an autodidact, independent learner's got has got a tiered text that is written in a format similar to what you've done here in Lover's Curse. How would you
Yeah.
recommend that they work through it if they don't
I
have the benefit of a teacher?
Yeah, well, I mean, autodidacts have the complete flexibility to work through things the way they want to. I recommend actually just reading it exactly as
Okay,
it's
so
written, like from
tier
start
one,
to
tier two, tier
finish.
three, final.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
go straight in line because that is sort of what I've been most used to reading it myself.
Okay.
And when you have something explained in a previous tier, it then gets used in the next tier pretty immediately.
Hmm.
So you will get, like, if something gets explained as something important, you get to use that information immediately. And if there's a word in a picture caption that is maybe a rare word, you need to know that for the next 5 minutes or so while you read
Mm.
the rest of that one section. You'll get exposed to that one rare word multiple times in a short period of time,
Mm.
versus
Yep.
if you read through all of tier one, then you go back and read through all of tier two, you get exposed to the same vocabulary, but it's like not watered down. It's like it's diluted by the rest of the text. Whereas here you're getting a concentrated look at each section of the text, thus getting more repetitions of each word in short, like in close proximity with each other.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about like, um, I run some statistics on the Greek New Testament. Like, John
Mm.
is a massively easier book to read than Galatians because John has like 18,000 words in it, and there's only, I think, about 1,000 lemmas, whereas Galatians has maybe 500 words, but and 500 lemmas, but half of them only show up once. So
Yes.
there's you don't have that repetition to help you learn anything new. It's like you kind of have to know it or look it up. Those are your two options.
Yeah, yeah. Know it, look it up, discuss it with someone, write notes about it, that kind of thing. Like keep using the language.
Yeah,
But a lot of texts aren't built because texts aren't built for learners.
right.
They don't repeat themselves like that. Learner texts like tiered texts can incorporate deliberate built-in repetition like this.
So let me ask you from the authoring perspective, right? Like you've got a passage of Virgil.
Mm.
Start at the original, and then how do you work backwards to make tier? And maybe you explained this earlier, but like how do you make tier three, and then how do you make tier two, and how do you make tier one? Like how does that? What's that process look like?
Yeah, I didn't invent this. It was invented. It was first I read about it from Kevin Ballestrini's article. I think he also had a co-author. I'm sorry, co-author. I can't remember your name. In it was called it was a tiered reading article. I should have looked this up before the podcast. But yeah, basically, I don't take credit for this, but this is the method that I use for making Virgil tiers. I take the original text of Virgil, and to make tier three, I rearrange the words in prose-like word order. Then to make tier two, I replace the difficult phrases or difficult words with easier synonyms while keeping more or less the syntactic structure of the sentences. Then to make tier one, I kind of start from scratch and explain it in as easy language as I can.
Hmm.
So that's how I make tier one, two, three. Uh, with my Phaedrus tiered reader, I actually only have 3 tiers total. And I start with the Phaedrus fable. I rearrange it into prose word order for tier two. That I also add in maybe a little bit of if there's some kind of ambiguity as to who's speaking, I might add in the name. Uh,
Yeah.
like a couple of implied words might work their way into tier two in that case. And then tier one, I do a mixture of replacing words with easier synonyms or writing a sentence from scratch to match this what the meaning of a sentence in tier two is. I do fewer tiers with Phaedrus because uh, his writing is easier. He
Mm.
doesn't need as much as Virgil does. He's an easier author.
Yes, I'm imagining similar comments would be made if someone was trying to do a New Testament tiered reader. They're like, John is good. Whoever wrote Hebrews needs some,
Yeah,
or
that's
Second
right.
Corinthians needs a lot more. Needs a couple extra tiers.
I feel a similar way to the Old Testament narratives of Genesis, the way that they're phrased are simple
Yes.
and even it's just endearing in how simple the narrative is. Like I'm reading through for Ezekiel, he can't yet understand anything, but I'm reading the big storybook, what do you call it, the biggest storybook Bible
Okay.
to him. He can't understand it yet, but I like to read it to him. It's got pretty pictures.
Yeah.
And I'm going through the Genesis narratives with him, and I'm reading this version of Genesis, which someone has tried to make more kid friendly. And I read it, and I'm like, actually, the translation of the Old Testament is clearer about what happens in the story here. Like you've maybe made it a little bit more colloquial, but you haven't made it easier to understand
Yeah.
what happens. Oh,
Yeah. No,
and
that's
actually, that's a problem with tiered text writing. Sometimes you go through all this effort to write a tiered text, and then your readers, like your students, read the original, and they're like, "Oh, that's easier to understand than the thing that you wrote before it, trying to explain what that said." And I'm like, "Oh,
but I wonder if that's a function of them having already worked through some of the stuff you've said. Like you've uploaded the concepts already so that when they hit that they can parse out the unfamiliar stuff. But
You're being kind. It actually just happens sometimes that a sentence is easier to read in the original than in the explanation." They're like, that makes way more sense. Misheard.
that's that's funny. Um, I was thinking about as you've been talking about tiered readers and stuff, it was reminding me of part of the conversation I just had with Colin Gorey about how, for us, when you're entering the world of the text, it's not only the language you have to deal with, but there's these concepts that, were everyday for, ancient Greeks or ancient Romans or ancient,
Mm,
Old English folks where we just don't think that way because we don't do things that way anymore.
a
Or
100%, a hundred
and so
percent. Like,
and so when you're reading the text, you've got to both comprehend the language and the world. And so with your tiered text, like you can dial potentially, it sounds like tier one can dial the language difficulty back and help them get the world concept. So when they finally make it to the final tier, they've already understood the world enough to process what's there.
yes, exactly. That is part of the purpose of that first tier, and even the pictures as well. There's
Yeah.
there's this whole it is a different world, the past, and concepts like a nurse, like a person who well, was probably a slave or a hired woman
Yeah.
who breastfeeds your infant for you so that you, the mother, don't have to breastfeed. Like that concept does not exist anymore.
No.
I'm glad. I'm glad because it was not a great profession to be in. We have formula now, and but it's completely alien to today's concept of the world.
Yeah.
And I have to explain that to kids while also like we have a text to read.
Well,
And it can be so interesting to
yeah.
explain all this. I guess that's why we're reading the text, is to give us an exploration of a world that's not like our own.
Yeah, it's true. I mean that is a good point. And then I'm just thinking about how, how words you have the mismatch between like things a word can refer to And so, we come
Hmm.
in thinking, oh, I know, like, okay, that's how I got the gloss for this word. It's like, so it means
Yeah.
that. And it's like, well, actually,
Yeah.
yes, but it also
You
means all these other things.
exactly like you gloss this word as nurse, and the image that students have in their mind is like the person who gives them a band-aid at school or something,
Yeah.
not the someone who breastfeeds your infant for you and then kind of becomes part of the family as a sort of incorporated in the structure, but still a slave and often is Greek speaking. I don't know. It's like
Yeah.
there's so many layers of who this person is from just the word nurse.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. And I mean, concepts related to government and society and the fact that, I think as an American, like we have upper middle, we have multiple classes, right? But it's not like
Mm,
if you're poor in America, it means you don't have access to money. It doesn't mean that you're enslaved and working, for someone with little to no pay, right? Like where my understanding is, in the ancient Roman Empire, like you were either rich or you were more probably a slave. Um,
mm.
and maybe I'm wrong on
The,
that.
the
I'm
the
not,
difference between wealth and status, I think, is quite extreme in the ancient world,
yeah,
given that slavery exists. I think that if slavery didn't exist in the ancient world, it wouldn't quite be as big a difference in uh, stature between the the haves and the have-nots. Um, but yeah, I think slavery does make a big difference, even though this is a topic that comes up in a lot of textbooks is like, how do we explain slavery to young people
mm,
who, like, without traumatizing them or anything, but explaining slavery and the Roman, it was for a long time a kind of fashion statement to make it about, well, Roman slavery wasn't that bad. Like compared to the Atlantic slave trade, Roman slavery was not race-based. It was just true. It was possible for people to be freed as a slave and to then live as a freedman. True, but slavery itself was brutal. Like
yeah,
sometimes these textbooks go way too far in trying to tone down slavery. That it just comes out as like, you know, you could look at someone and not tell whether they were a poor person or a slave. And I think of that statement now, and I'm like, that doesn't mean that slavery was good, only that it was on the outside looking similar to being a poor person.
it's
On
not
the
funny, but
inside, yeah, on the inside, they know that they have no time off, and that's not great. Like you wouldn't necessarily know that from the outside, how much can this person experience the equivalent of a Sabbath, you know?
yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
It's
okay.
yeah.
So let me jump on to another thing while we're here. Like we sort of said, like part of making a text comprehensible to a reader is the cultural world or conceptual world that the text was produced in. So, do you have any cool tips, recommendations for how people can learn that? Aside from like tiered readers and things, like any favorite books or
Oh, how
resources?
to learn about the culture of the ancient world. This is very difficult for me to answer because I've been reading ancient texts in translation and in the original, and I've been kind of dabbling in ancient world studies, done it in university. I've kind of picked it up from everywhere.
Yeah.
How does an autodidact pick up all these things? Um, I'll give a cheeky recommendation. Historical fiction. Good
Okay.
historical fiction will introduce you to the world pretty well.
That's a
Like
good point.
Robert Harris's Imperium, which details the life of Cicero. It's a trilogy, actually. It goes Imperium, Lustrum, Dictator. And I'm actually rereading it right now because I was thinking about reading a biography of Cicero, and I was thinking, that's boring. I'd like to read a fictional biography of Cicero. So I'm just rereading Harris's Cicero trilogy.
Well, and for those uh I just pulled it up on Amazon. It's the Kindle ebook is $2 at the moment. So for the first one, I think the
It
price is
wasn't
set.
for me. It was about 14 Australian dollars.
Yeah, I think the rest of the series is if you bought the whole series, it'd be about 30 US. So I'm guessing they're selling the first one cheaper to try to get you to buy the others. But
Yes,
anyway,
that would be a good way to do it. Oof, this baby is very warm today. It's a warm November day in
that's right. We're
Australia.
we're on opposite sides of the planet. So where I'm cold, you guys are warm, right?
Yes, that's right. It's quite stinking hot right now. Um, but yeah, I would say read a good historical fiction writer. Go for the reviews of someone who has done their research,
Yeah.
and they will be able to introduce you to a lot of the features of the world. They might repeat uh some things that have since been disproven, but so will academic sources.
True.
So you might as well get it in the most fun way, which is experience it through fictional media, uh, historical fiction. The Rome TV series, although gory and full of sex scenes, is also quite accurate in the tone and the overall look and aesthetic and the feel of the Roman world.
Hmm. Well, and that, and like you said, if you pick up a few, I guess like we said earlier, if you pick up a few classroom language things, exposure to real text will hopefully take care of that. If you pick up a few,
Yes.
anachronisms or inaccuracies, exposure to the text will hopefully cure you of that
Will
as you read it.
help to do that. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh, oh, I don't include things like the films Gladiator,
Oh,
etc.
come
Like
on.
you read the reviews, get a kind of the
Yeah.
extremely popular movies set in the ancient world can be a bit misleading and often tell you a bit more about what the the society of the people making the film
Yeah.
is like versus what the actual ancient world was like. But like films are extremely expensive to make. The sets are extremely expensive. Novels are not so expensive. It just takes someone researching it well
Hmm.
to give you an accurate, vivid impression of the ancient world through them. But yeah, do your research. Which one's well researched? Not all of them are well researched.
Yeah. That's that's a it's a good point. It's a good recommendation though. I like that because like you said, that's a whole lot more fun and easier than you're reading a dry textbook, which may be wrong as well. So,
Mm.
um,
Our understanding is always advancing.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, and
Uh, yes, you go.
that's one of the things that, like you mentioned, that you've been exposed to text, ancient world through translation, right? Like, I mean, I grew up, I grew up going to church. I still do. It's like, so you read the Bible,
Mm.
but then when you start learning Hebrew and learning more about the culture and the research on the ancient Near East and stuff, like you get a little bit beyond the popular level stuff. You realize there's all this stuff hidden in these texts that it's like, wow, that world is massively different than Sunday
Mm.
school made me think it was. And,
Mm.
you know, and then like your translations often sanitize things. Like you were saying with the little storybook Bible, it's like there's some really interesting things going on here that no one talks about for a variety of reasons.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
so
it definitely smooths it over.
yeah.
But
Um,
that the biggest story book Bible, I feel like the writer did do a good job of giving a high level view of certain stories, like pointing out the parallels between certain events in a
mm,
story.
mhm.
They were quite good at drawing attention to that, which a literal reading of the text was. For me, I didn't necessarily pick up on those kind of parallels, those patterns of the story, and that I've been quite happy to read. Um, yeah, there's sometimes these high level summaries do bring out things that aren't there in the nitty gritty.
Well, and that's I think habits of reading. I've had this conversation a couple of times with people in the last, I don't know, weeks, months, whatever. But like, with difficult ancient texts, we're taught almost to read them, especially specifically the Bible, which is my primary experience. Like we're taught to read them and basically strip mine each sentence but that's not how communication works. And so when you
Mm.
actually if you get to the point where you can read it fluently and read large chunks, you start to notice that this chunk is parallel with that one. And this language sounds like something I heard chapters or books ago, and they're playing off each other, which you can't get
Mm.
if you don't develop that fluency um, to be able to
Yes.
read large chunks of it.
Exactly. Like the biblical texts are written as texts, as literature, as poetry, narrative,
Yeah.
letters, all of that. And I'm just imagining how the practice of reading letters aloud in church would be like you'd read the entirety of, I don't know, Hebrews aloud, or actually it was Hebrews an epistle?
It does have an ending that makes it sound like one. The opening, not so
Yeah.
much, but for that matter,
Yeah,
neither does First
that one
John.
sounds
So
super dense to read in one go. But a lot of these epistles, just reading it aloud in one go,
yeah,
to the church it was addressed to, that would be really different to the way that we explore these texts a lot of the time. I think there is value in looking at the details of something, but it's so that you can then zoom back out again and see how it all comes together.
yeah,
You need the you need the oh, sorry, that's burping. You need the whole picture, and the details give you like they add together to give you the overall impression.
yeah, yeah. No, and that's true. And I mean, I think that I know we're talking, biblical text, but I'm sure that applies elsewhere as well. I'm sure Homer is playing off of other things, and other people are referring to Homer and playing. I'm sure
Oh,
this way
we
of
have no
working.
idea what this like the sources of Homer is extremely mysterious. Like,
Mm,
because Homer himself may not have been one person. It could
right.
be a whole lot of people writing in different dialects that eventually merge into one text and then get smoothed over into a different dialect of um yeah, Homer's world is mysterious.
Yeah.
It's we can't look at, say, a depiction of Agamemnon and say, well, Homer was writing in the time of this king specifically, and so he's talking about the vices of this king obliquely by talking about the vices of Agamemnon. But when you read Virgil, you can be like, Virgil's writing under Augustus, and he's not allowed to criticize Augustus. So when he talks about various forms of tyranny and things going wrong with imperial power, he's talking about Augustus doing things wrong. I think that's debatable, but like there will be debates about that where you can't have those kind of debates with Homeric texts.
Well, so interestingly enough, I was talking to another, you know, linguist kind of person, um, in person a couple weeks ago, months at this point. I don't know. Anyway,
Mm.
days bleed into each other. Um, but we're talking about literature and stuff, and his wife mentioned this thing called like Epic the Musical, which is on YouTube. It's somebody's turning the Odyssey into a like stage production, but they have these like cartoon animated,
Ooh.
videos right now, and apparently there's a debate in Homer about who killed um what's it is it Paris's son? Like who kills the baby?
Oh,
And so
oh,
whoever
who
took
kills Astyanax? Is that it?
I guess I don't
Or
remember his name, but apparently like this musical took the interpretation that it was Odysseus, which is I found out is apparently held up by like some of the other poets say it was Odysseus. Some say
mm.
Odysseus just said we have to kill this kid or he's going to come back to bite us. And you know,
Yeah. There
some
are
people said
multiple
it was somebody else. So
versions.
yeah,
Yeah. There's different versions of how culpable Helen is in this. Like in
mm,
some versions she's kidnapped, in some versions she's seduced and goes along willingly. And that seems like a pretty important detail of like, did Helen want to be captured by Paris and start the war? But
yeah,
yeah, a bit of a critical detail that is debatable according to the version that you read.
yeah. Well, that's someday one of my dreams is to read it in the original Greek, but that's a ways off yet. I
Yeah,
always manage
well,
to take the back burner to other things.
you can always get to Gregory Stringer, the no, not Gregory Stringer, Jeffrey
Stedman,
Stedman's
yes.
Yeah, those I read through one of those books on the Odyssey on Jeffrey Stedman, the one
Hmm.
with the Cyclops.
Okay.
It's like I went straight to the Cyclops passage, read that. The dialect is crazy to begin with.
Yeah.
It's like, is that an infinitive? What? And and then you get used to it, and it's not the hardest text to read, really. It's Homer's writing is quite clear, quite paratactic, they would say.
Mm.
It's not extremely subordinated like Paul's writing would be,
Yeah.
but more like the Genesis narrative and.
It's the trouble for me is just the vocab, right? Like there's just so
Mm.
much if you've there's just so many new words to to conquer. That's usually what defeats me. But yeah, the grammar was in some ways easier because you don't have all the contract verbs. Um,
Yes.
and so you kind of, when you look at something new, you have a better sense of what the root of the word might be. You have to go look it up. Whereas
Hmm.
sometimes
In
with the vowel
theory.
changes, in theory.
In theory, sometimes verbs have such irregular principal parts that you just, what?
Mm,
What?
yeah, there is
Uh,
that.
but I did notice that with Homeric vocabulary, it's a bit more like Proto-Indo-European and therefore a little bit more like Latin. So the word for sheep, it always cracks me up that the word for sheep in New Testament Greek and I think in Attic as well is provaton,
Yeah.
the thing that walks forward.
Oh, you're right. That is, well, that
Yeah,
is what that
thing
would,
that walks forward. That's a
yeah.
sheep. That's not a very descriptive image of a sheep, but sure, it does. It does that. It's a livestock animal that walks forward, and might as well specify that. Like, might as well have that word become specifically the sheep, provaton. Uh, but the word in Homeric Greek is ovus, which
Oh,
sounds
always.
so much like always in Latin. Yeah. But because the digamma, the wort sound dropped
Mm.
out, I think that's why that word became harder and harder for people to say. And so they just went to provadon. That's my pet theory. Probably someone who knows a bit more about philology will have something to say about that. But I reckon it's the sound change that caused ovus to drop out of use as a word.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll have to,
Yeah.
I'll have to do that, hunt down another philologist to have on here who's like, knows the history of how Greek became what it was. That'd be interesting.
Mm. But like reading Homeric Greek and the way that it uses articles and or
Yep.
not doesn't use articles the same way as Attic Greek, it just felt more Latiny.
Yeah.
It felt more at home in some ways, but very alien in others because of its Homeric diction. Yeah.
So I know people have said like, I've heard the advice when you're learning Greek, pick a dialect and learn that and then explore the others. But I did actually find that really helpful, like the
Mm.
tiny bit of Homeric of learning that like these articles aren't really doing articly things like they do in
Yeah.
Koine. Because
Yeah.
there's cases in Koine when you're reading and like, I think that doesn't quite add up to how articles are usually used. And then it's like, oh, that's feels like it's more matches more like the Homeric usage or something. Like I've run
Yes,
into some stuff
sometimes it has
recently.
these callbacks. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes it feels like they have these callbacks to the way that the article gets used in this earlier form of Greek. It kind of it's still around, even as these other uses evolve around it. So yeah, exactly. I think yeah, it is definitely good to pick a dialect, read a bunch from that dialect, and then pick another one, read a bunch. Uh, I think yeah, in general, if only we could have um more learner texts in ancient Greek
Well,
that
that
aren't just Attic learner texts as well,
mm,
especially. Oof. But yeah, it almost seems like you have to either learn Attic or Koine first, and then you can go for a an interesting dialect like Herodotus's histories or Homer's Iliad.
well, like I said, there's definitely mumblings in the tech side of the Greek community to like the people who are thinking about tooling and tools to help us help writers produce those kinds of things. So hopefully in the next year we'll see some better stuff for folks like you who are writing and um,
Mm.
make that process easier. So um, Yeah. So Carla,
Okay,
let me.
my baby is babbling right now.
I love
I
it.
think he's hit his wake window. Was there anything else that we needed to discuss, or maybe I should actually kind of pay attention to him?
No, I was actually just going to say, I think we've hit usually about the hour mark, and you have your son to take care of. So if people want to find you and follow your work in Greek or Latin or catch up with you, where is the best place to do that?
Foundinantiquity.com is sort of the central hub that I've got all my stuff linked to.
Yeah.
I have a Latin YouTube channel, Found in Antiquity Latin, and I've got a Greek one, Found in Antiquity Greek, which I've been putting stuff on again, even though it was on like a hiatus for about a year or so. I am still doing stuff in Greek occasionally. And also, I'm on Twitter at found, and then because the word is too long, found in antiquity is too long. It's like found and then the letter N and then antiquity. I'm also on Blue Sky, found in antiquity.
All right. Well, I will put all that in the show notes, and people can hunt you down and find you there.
Yeah, oh yeah,
So,
get your free copy of The Lover's Curse. It's actually free if you sign up to my email newsletter. If you go onto foundinantiquity.com, you'll see a big banner that says get your free Latin tiered reader of Aeneid Book 4, and you can sign up to my email newsletter to get that and
yeah.
hear about when my Phaedrus Fables tiered reader comes out as well.
And you've written some other, like in your blog, you've written some, opinion and, thought pieces on how to learn languages
On
and stuff like that too,
learning,
which is,
pedagogy.
yep, some
Yeah.
cool. All right. Well, Carla, thank you so much for coming on, and hope you have a good day and best of luck with the newborn.
Thank you so much, Fletcher. It was a real pleasure to be on.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under a Creative Commons 3.0 attribution license. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.